Okay, so I think we're going to get started. I know a few people are still filtering in, but we're just going to get going here with our presentation and our webinar. And so our webinar today is on implementing asset management in your municipality. I will be hosting and facilitating the discussions today and introducing our guest speakers in a bit. So just a little bit of housekeeping for everyone. I'm just trying to change my own slide. So again, we do have simultaneous interpretation available to listen in French or in English. If you're hearing me with no other voices, you're on the English channel, but if you go to that little interpretation icon, you can switch over to the French. We will have two presentations, and after the presentations, we will have question and answers. You should, as participants, have a question and answer box available to you in the chat function. Feel free as we are going through to put your questions in that chat box, and when we are done presenting, we will go in sort of order, presenting the questions back to our guest speakers. I also just want to take a minute and recognize that I am joining today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, and Passamaquoddy people. They have been the caretakers of this land since time immemorial, and would like, where it is Indigenous History Month in Canada, for folks, if possible, to put in the chat where they're joining from today. I do know Chris I believe is joining us from Ontario, and Scott and Colin are joining us from BC, I believe. And I'm sure that they will sort of touch on that or a little bit more about them when we get there. So I just wanted to do a brief overview of FCM. If you're joining us today, you likely know a little bit about FCM or have heard about us, but we are for the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. I suppose, sorry, I got excited and didn't introduce myself. I'm Felix Vandergrift. I'm the events officer for the Municipal Asset Management Program. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. And yeah, so a little bit about our programs. We have previous and current and future programs. MSIP is one that ended last year, but it was the Municipal Climate Innovation Program that dealt mostly with getting municipalities to net zero, climate leadership, and climate mitigation. The Green Municipal Fund is the major program still active at FCM doing funding, and they work in major sectors such as transportation and energy. You can find out more about them at greenmunicipalfund.ca. Sarah will be posting links to that shortly. And the future of this is the adaptation program under the National Adaptation Strategy. At the very end of our program today, we will have some links in which you can go to sort of sign up for newsletters or anything like that if you don't have that information. And then a little bit about the MAP program. So this program is coming to an end next year, but we have been active for about 8 years. And it's a $110 million investment from the Infrastructure Canada, the federal government. And the whole purpose of it was to help municipalities make better infrastructure investment decisions through asset management practices, and sort of getting reliable data, but also a little bit of the storytelling, which is what we're going to be doing today. So a little bit of an overview of today's agenda. You joined us for a webinar based on the implementing asset management in your community. So a lot of people have this question. Either they've done some asset management work or they are looking to do some asset management plans or policies. And, maybe they've already done that. And now you're kind of wondering, okay, well, where do we go from here? So to help us with that today, we invited Chris Chen, who is the executive director from AM Ontario, who will go first and speak a little bit about this thematic package and implementation of asset management within your municipality. And then to sort of contextualize that a little from a boots on the ground perspective, we have Scott Barry, who is the Chief Administrative Officer for Northern Rockies Regional Municipality, which you will see as NRRM for short. And Colin Sunderland, who is infrastructure planning engineer, that is a consultant who's worked with Northern Rockies for quite a long time, I think. So, and then after that, we will have a question and answer period where we will get to everyone's questions, hopefully. But it's going to be a bit more of a discussion where we will pose questions, hopefully, to the presenters. So I'm going to start first and introduce Chris, and then hand it over to him. So Chris is the Executive Director of Asset Management Ontario, which is a nonprofit community of practice whose mission is to strengthen infrastructure asset management capacity across Ontario's public sector. And just on a personal note, has been an active member of a lot of meetings that we've been at together. And I've learned a lot just from listening to him talk about his excitement around asset management and learning and training. So I'm also excited to see his presentation today. So Chris, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll give you the reins and take it away. Oh, let me just, oh, how do I stop sharing? Yeah, there we go.
Great. Thank you very much, Felix. And thanks everyone for coming out today. Can you just confirm, Felix, that you can see the screen okay?
We can see it and it's in presenter mode, so you're good.
Terrific. Thank you. In some ways, I'm really excited to have a discussion about how your municipality can advance, or not just municipality, how your organization can advance its asset management program. Because it's if you had this conversation 2 or 3 years ago, it would have been much more about the nuts and bolts about what goes into a policy or what goes into an asset management plan. So the very fact that we're having this shows that there is some considerable degree of sector progress. And that's something that I think is borne out by a lot of the asset management readiness scale report backs or benchmarks that municipalities have been giving. So so my discussion is really going to be talking about at a very high level the process of implementing asset management. And there's really 3 parts to my presentation. Distinguishing between idealized versus actual asset management journeys. And I'll say a little bit why that's important. This is a little bit corny, but distinguishing between dance steps versus dancing, and using that as an analogy about kind of learning about asset management and learning the components of asset management versus doing asset management. And a good way of looking at that is to actually look at a challenging issue. And for a lot of municipalities, that could be, for example, building climate resilience. And then we'll kind of just outline or go through the thematic package. In many ways, this is a resource for all of you on the call to sort of dip into and utilize and tailor for your specific needs. So the whole point about, I think what happens, and I should say a little bit about Asset Management Ontario and where we're coming from. Like we're a community of practice, a nonprofit community of practice. Our mission is to build public sector asset management capacity across Ontario. And through that work, we've worked with over 200 municipalities, including some of you on this call over the past several years. And I think that what sometimes happens is that when people look at doing asset management, they look at some of the key milestones, and for them that could be having an asset management policy, and then maybe from there developing an asset management plan. And I think the tendency is sometimes to look at those as endpoints or as milestones, and they are milestones and they are really important. But in some sense, but sometimes, and I say this sometimes because it doesn't necessarily apply to everybody, but sometimes when municipalities come up with an asset management policy and then an asset management plan, it's as if that they expect the floodgates to open, a real sheet of clean ice, and then that somehow facilitates their being able to incorporate levels of service, risk management, the link between asset management and budgeting. It's supposed to facilitate doing all of that. And on some level, yes, because that's what asset management is, that's partly how asset management drives value. But on another important level, no. And so what often happens is that the asset management journey is a lot trickier. And by that, I think you probably recognize a lot of these obstacles. There's staff turnover. And with that, sometimes the loss of the asset management champion or loss of a lot of knowledge. There's budget pressures. And so even though you go through an asset management process in your municipality, at the end of the day, council then goes back at the budget table and then sort of picks and chooses projects like they always have. Competing demands, you all have a lot of responsibilities. And then the whole point about asset management is it takes a long view, but with council, there's turnover every 4 years. And with that, the risk of changing priorities. The irony about all of this is that so first of all, it's very typical for municipalities to plateau, especially after they've gotten a policy and a plan. And they plateau for some of these reasons. The irony is that our asset management, if it's done well, actually helps address and helps you overcome a lot of these challenges that are on this screen. So part of the challenge, and I don't know how to talk about this without sounding pretty corny, but is from what we've observed when we work with municipalities is that we often when people learn asset management, they learn it in discrete steps. And then you have to learn it that way. I mean, it's just sort of, you do data gap analyses, you set your community and technical levels of service, you make sure that they're aligned, you do risk assessments for different services or asset classes, you'll go through life cycle costing exercises, all of that stuff. But what happens more often than not is that just ends up in a plan or in a document, and it doesn't really get acted upon. And so the question is why? And the question and the so what is how do you make this work? And it's a little bit like thinking about learning the discrete steps of asset management as almost like you're learning dance steps. But when you're putting it all together, it's a little bit more like dancing. Another analogy is like if you're learning to play an instrument, that's kind of like the what you're seeing on the left. And then playing in an orchestra would be more the analogy of asset management. Now, to kind of make this come home or more tangible, you can pick any kind of problem. And if you step back, what asset management should do is it should generate value and better outcomes for your municipality. Otherwise, it's really not worth your time. And one way of thinking about it is to take any hard problem that your municipality faces. And so for many of them, it's a question that comes up by a lot of councils raise is, how do we become more resilient to climate risks? Well, asset management offers a powerful framework to address that. But if you kind of just scratch a little bit underneath the surface and say, well, what does that entail to address climate risk through asset management? You have to do things like understand the risks and disruptions to your municipality services that might be climate related. You have to incorporate those climate inputs or risk inputs into a broader risk assessment process for different assets or services. Then you have to go through a prioritization process of identifying cost-effective, high-impact strategies. And then you have to implement it and you have to monitor and modify it. But if you think about how any of that gets done, you have to talk to your frontline staff, the people who actually work with the assets and deliver the services, because they're going to have a really, really keen sense about what works, what doesn't work, what breaks down, what lasts, where the weak points are, all those kinds of things. You're going to have to engage your planners in terms of not just some of the growth in terms of your population, but also how a changing climate, how all of that impacts your life cycle of your assets. You're going to have to engage your treasurer, of course, because all of these changes impact the bottom line. You have to engage your engineering because they have the inside expertise of understanding how all of this works physically and technically. And I think people kind of know that, but it's actually pretty hard to do. But that's also the crux about where value is generated in this process. It is absolutely not a desk exercise. And I think that if your municipality really commits to asset management as a framework and as a process that can generate more value, it has to embrace asset management as a dynamic and collaborative process. And as part of this, FCM asked to create a resource on helping municipalities implement asset management better, and to take it from a step of maybe you have a policy and a plan, where do you go from there? And there's three components about this resource. There was a case study, there's actually a checklist tool, and then there is a video. In terms of a case study, one of the great things to recognize, especially if you're from a smaller municipality, is that you can use that to your advantage. The municipality, the Northern Rockies municipality, Scott and Colin, who will be speaking after this, will be able to sort of showcase some of what they do, which is just really, really great stuff. The Ville de Saint-Quentin in New Brunswick is another really good example. But what's common among both of these examples, small municipal examples, is that there's good leadership, there's excellent coordination among senior staff. They're often the staff, and not just one or two people, but the across the organization, there's active engagement and training and collaboration, and they really work to integrate processes and systems. I think you'll really see this in Scott and Colwyn's presentation coming up. So there's a case study, and so if you're a small municipality, use that to your advantage, because you can be more nimble. You can cut across the silos a little bit more easily. There's also that education and training piece, that engagement piece. And for some municipalities, they get to a point where they do it among themselves as staff, but then it's sort of that connection between staff and then council becomes a little bit harder to bridge. So we created this video to help senior staff, or not just senior staff, but staff across the municipality, councilors or elected officials, as well as residents, get a sense about what implementing asset management is about. And I hope you find this entertaining. There's a link at the bottom of this screen, and I think it'll be shared with you. It's available both in English and French. It's a short video. It's about 4.5 minutes, and it's worth watching. And I encourage you, especially if you have a steering committee or a council and you want to show this, it's actually a really good thing to show. The third thing that's part of this resource package is that there's a checklist, and it's a checklist that's meant to be used collaboratively. So it's, for example, a good context to use this for would be as part of your asset management team or steering committee. You can also use it individually, but it's meant to be used as a team. And what it's meant to do is assess areas of strength. Where does your municipality, what is it doing well? What are its areas for continuous improvement? And it gives you some way of benchmarking progress. And so this is just kind of a snippet about what that checklist is. They're just 20 questions, so it's actually fairly quick to go through. And you basically just click yes, no, partial, or unsure. And it's all of these questions or statements are aligned with the asset management, the different competency areas of the asset management readiness scale, as well as with other resources like ISO and IAM and so forth. But what this is really about is it's meant to be a simple tool to facilitate reflection about where you are in your asset management program, what some of the gaps are, and to maybe help you identify where you can be headed. So what it tries to do is the statements try to indicate what the dance might look like, or what the orchestral piece will sound like, if you will. And then you sort of work that back in terms of your actual steps. There are a bunch of helpful resources, and I've got some on the screen here. And FCM also just literally, I think, just released today a new resource on collaboration, which I think is also very good. And with that, I'll turn this back over to Felix.
I don't know if you can hear that. That's my my timer going off for you, Chris, to give you a 2-minute warning. So you timed that so well. That was really interesting. I know we had a couple of really nice comments about the analogy of dance, like learning the dance steps versus learning versus like understanding how to like actually do the dance. So that's kind of, I like that analogy a lot. I think that speaks to having content that you can read versus having content that you understand is usually how I sort of draw that analogy too. So yeah, that's really great. So if people have folks about that presentation, please use the Q&A boxes now. And we will come back to that after we have our second, we're not answering questions at this point. We're going to keep going right through. But we have posted links in the chat for people so that they can view the video that Chris was talking about, and also check out any of the resources. We will be posting more links as we go along. So just to give people an idea. So now I have the pleasure of introducing Northern Rockies Regional Municipality. And just on, again, a personal note, I want to thank you both for being here, understanding that there's wildfires in your area and you have a lot of literal and metaphorical fires that you're probably putting out day to day. So we appreciate that you're able to take this time and join us. So I'm introducing Scott today, who's the Chief Administrative Officer for Northern Rockies Regional Municipality. And I had to pull some of this from your LinkedIn, Scott, so please bear with me if some of it is not as up to date as it should be. But you've been with them for about 14 years and worked as a Director of Public Works, and you were previously a plant manager for Canfor. And my understanding is that that experience really helped with sort of project management and really embedding asset management as a like a purposeful culture in your regional municipality. And with him is Colin, and you are an infrastructure planning engineer that has been with KWL, a consulting engineer firm, working with local governments and Indigenous communities on finance and asset management. So I will hand it over to you folks now and stop sharing my screen, and you should be able to share yours. And I believe you're both pinned so folks can see you. Perfect.
Thanks.
That looks good.
Felix. Okay, we're good. Thanks, Felix. Good day, everyone. My name is Scott Berrien, and I'm the CEO of the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality, in short, NRM, located in northern British Columbia. Proud to work and recreate on the many Indigenous traditional territories in the region, including the Dene, Cree, and the Kaska peoples. I'll be co-presenting with Coleman, so he's driving today, not literally driving, but figuratively driving the presentation. And we're about kitty corner in British Columbia. I'm northeast BC, and Coleman's about 1,800 kilometers away, either on Vancouver Island or in Burnaby. I'm not quite sure where you are today, Coleman.
In Burnaby today.
You're in Burnaby today. So we'll be co-presenting. We'll be talking about the implementation of our asset management system, specifically focusing on our journey to operationalizing asset management and the tools that we've developed to assist us in the journey, or in that journey. Our relationship with Kerwood Lytle, or KWL, started in 2013 when we enlisted their help in developing an asset management program. At that time, we had nothing. We were literally starting off at ground zero. So no plan whatsoever, no system whatsoever. It's been a strong relationship. It's been a great relationship with KWL since the beginning. And today we view KWL as partners in this journey. We've done a lot together and a lot of trial and error. And we'll talk about a little bit about that and where we are today. A shout out and a thank you to FCM in Canada for contributing funding for us to help develop our program, and that enabled our project and giving us the opportunity to present and share our story today. Who are we? Just a very quick overview of who we are. The NRM So Northern Rockies Regional Municipality, we are the only regional municipality in BC. You'll see in the slide a visual of the province of BC, and then up in the top right-hand corner, in the northeast corner, you'll see the red area, which is our region. We mean the Northern Rockies, the NRM. We have a very unique governance structure compared to any other local government in BC. As I mentioned, we're the only regional municipality. I won't get into that detail. That's another story in itself. And we're not here to talk about governance today, but if you are interested or have any questions, feel free to reach out to me about that. In terms of geographical size, we're about 85,000 square kilometers, which is about 10% of the total landmass of BC. We're about twice the size of Vancouver Island, if you've ever been on the island. Our population is approximately 4,000 people, so about 0.1% of the population of British Columbia. So from a density perspective, we do not have a high density, which mostly reside, most of those residents reside in the community of Fort Nelson, which serves as a service center for the region. We are small from a population perspective, of course. We have a significant amount of infrastructure spread out over a large footprint to provide the vast amount of services to the region. Besides our typical water, roads, et cetera, sewer, we also are responsible for things like 10 landfills. We have 2 regional campgrounds. We have a regional airport, fire rescue area that covers the entire region. So it's not uncommon for our fire rescue to attend a scene on the Yukon border and then another scene on the Northwest Territory borders, just to put it in perspective in terms of the vast area they cover and the services we provide. To provide those services to the region, and as a relatively small organization, having a well-functioning asset management system and systems that are well documented is a core requirement for our to be successful and to deliver those services. A high-level look at our 10-year journey. We started to develop our system in 2013, which has evolved significantly over time and has been a process of continuous improvement. And I like the slide that Chris had in his presentation around progress can be tricky. And again, this is not a linear process. There's ups and downs, there's pauses throughout the process. And it's just part of, as Chris had said, it's part of that dance. Our system embodied sound principles and policies, but originally it didn't initially integrate well enough with our existing business processes. The focus was mainly on assets from a financial perspective, where today we're working towards operationalizing asset management, making it part of our day-to-day operations and the systems within it. We have designed and implemented various tools over time as part of this evolution, which we continue to refine as part of our continuous improvement process.
Thanks, Scott.
I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of emphasize, I guess, on this slide that we've got a couple of important pieces that we're going to be talking about further in this presentation around implementing or operationalizing asset management, beginning in about 2016, when we developed something we called the Asset Management Playbook, which we're going to introduce. And some of the experiences that we had from that. And I think, Chris, if I can lean into the analogy that you gave us all, wonderful analogy in your presentation. When we started talking about operationalizing asset management in 2016, we spent a lot of time mapping out dance steps. And what I'm showing on the screen here right now was sort of an illustration that was at the heart of what we had developed with a sort of playbook for making asset management day-to-day business, which was very much what we had desired to do. NRM had established an asset management policy through council in 2015. And so we had a framework in place. We kind of knew what we wanted to do with the organization and identified a number of different teams within NRM that would sort of be guided by an overarching strategy and planning team. We had an inventory sub-team, operations and project delivery, financial planning and management, and community awareness. And each of those sort of sub-teams was intended to have specific roles. So I'd like to use again that analogy, specific dance steps that we needed for the organization to do asset management together. This worked reasonably well with a lot of support through sort of regular meetings to keep track of things. But what we were finding was that it was quite complex. It was probably too complex for a first foray into asset management practice day to day. And that we had some kind of capacity issues, particularly in some of these sub teams, that was preventing the whole thing from kind of working nicely together. So we had the dance steps, but we weren't quite dancing yet. Fast forward to 2019, and I'd say that we were already sort of talking a lot about how we were going to sort of revamp, revitalize, maybe move into a version 2.0 of the asset management playbook. When FCM opened up an intake on the MAMP program, and it was a second intake that NRM had participated in the first intake as well. And so with this, we knew that we needed to build something that would sort of be useful, not just for NRM, but for the asset management community more broadly. And we began sort of brainstorming around this idea of mapping organizational processes, because we had started that way with this complex process map for the asset management playbook. And we'd been working through some others for things like capital planning as well. So we wanted to look at sort of how we could use this approach broadly or generally to resolve a number of key questions that we had about how the organization was working together. And some of those are shown on the screen. So I like thinking about this as a bit of creative chaos. And I think, again, Chris, you did a great job of sort of acknowledging how we really do need to go through sort of an iterative journey in making asset management practice day-to-day work, a day-to-day practice, sort of integrating into what we do. So when we talk about process mapping, what do we really mean? At its heart and its simplest, it's really just a process flowchart. So, you know, Scott, I think from your experience working in a plant environment before you started working with the municipality, and we were talking about this, you'd be very familiar with process flowcharts for an industrial process, and business process flowcharts function very much the same way and use some of the same symbols. And another key thing with this is that there's a lot of information that needs to reside behind this flowchart for it to work. It's nice because it's simple and scalable and it's understandable by lots of people. So it's kind of a good point of entry into working asset management practices and principles into the work that you do every day.
A key point to our success has been the need to have involvement. You know, we have to drive that culture right down into the organization, and having the right people involved and invested in the program is extremely important. To do that, all of our department heads are part of this process. So all the various directors were part of it, and it was important that they were part of it, and they were empowered to be part of the process and make decisions as part of this and be involved. So there was a level of ownership. That engagement was important. But to achieve this also, it's important to have that top-down approach. So I had to be involved. I had to own it, explain why I felt it was important, be part of that team, demonstrate the importance to that team. What resulted was a very high level of engagement and energy from that group, which led into larger discussions, and those larger discussions then led into other discussions regarding organizational-wide opportunities, which we recognize that this system or this process can also is a great tool to help with navigating through a lot of the other opportunities we have in the organization.
So one of the key things that I think really worked when we engaged with Scott and his directors, the senior staff in NRM, and I worked with a co-facilitator with KWL to really start to try and tease out some of those key issues or key opportunities that we wanted to focus on with sort of this process mapping approach and remapping sort of how we do asset management day to day. And we really started with a sequence of very simple questions. But some of those questions were kind of key because we needed to reach into not just what the individuals around the table were experiencing, but also what their teams were experiencing. And these simple questions led to, you know, such a strong and engaged conversation in our initial meeting on this that we actually scheduled a second follow-up session to talk about scoping where we were going to go with this project and what processes we wanted to map. And in order to determine sort of how what we would do as a methodology for developing process maps for some of those issues that we had identified, we reached out to the World Wide Web to have a look at sort of what advice is out there on a generalized process or methodology for mapping business processes. And we identified a few resources on the web and kind of expanded on some of those, and ended up with this graphic as sort of our first iteration, or for our starting place for how we would proceed through a sequence of orderly steps to develop a process map and then implement it. And one of the key things I'll emphasize here, and this is a kind of a recurring theme in this, is we needed to identify in this process how we would measure success. How would we know that the business process that we were implementing or fine-tuning or improving or even just documenting is working effectively? So we looked at sort of smart performance metrics or KPIs that we would need to follow in order to ensure that a business process works, monitor it, and then also schedule in and be deliberate about a sort of a continuous improvement cycle. That first iteration led to something we wanted to have sort of a document and a process map, I guess, of its own for how to develop a process map. And the idea behind this was going to be something that NRM could use that would be repeatable for process mapping, business process development in the organization, but also something, with the FCM funding, recognizing that we wanted to give something back to the asset management community, that we would produce something that could be utilized by any organization that's involved in delivering infrastructure services for mapping a business process. And so we came up with this essentially a generalized process that works in sort of 3 phases: initiation, then scoping, development, and then implementation. And with that sort of sequence of more specific steps, but also recognizing that in each of these phases, you need to go through iterative cycles in order to ensure that you're ready to move on to the next one. And so the document that we produced on how to develop a process map, we also produced 2 specific documents in draft that documented sort of 2 big really groups of business processes. And we ended up calling one of them a system and the other one a program. A system for managing documents in NRM, and a program for training and development. And this is just an example, a couple of visuals from the training and development process map or system map that was developed. So one of the process maps here that I'm showing on the screen is for implementation of training and development. And there's a couple of key elements to this. It's what's called a swim lane chart, which indicates that there's sort of different people or positions that are responsible for particular steps in the process and decision steps. The items that are shown in blue are components of that process that are already well established in NRM and are working well and are consistent across the organization. We also identified a number of things in red that are not currently in place or are not kind of being used consistently across different departments. And so we use those things to denote those differences. And this is really a key step showing sort of how a business process map can be fine-tuned or documented to ensure that you're meeting those organizational objectives. And just another view, a very generalized view of what we think about sort of as a continuous improvement cycle for process mapping through development, using the process map, monitoring performance in terms of how well that process is actually working with those KPIs, and then making incremental improvements, maybe once every few years, it may be once every year for a process that's used very frequently.
And what have we learned so far? Well, processes are interdependent. Scoping can take a lot of time. It can be quite time consuming, especially if it's a challenging topic or issue, but it's also an opportunity. And to use an old cliche, it's some short-term pain for long-term gain. You get the long-term benefits from the process. Well, we've learned that workshops help with team building. Changing processes may also involve culture change. We also learn that busy people tend to give their time generously when they feel they're making real progress, and that's when we talk department heads and directors, their time is valuable, and when they have that level of ownership and empowerment, they make themselves available. And it also provides them with that empowerment to institute change, which we all know that sometimes, change management and organization can be challenging. And we also learn that process maps work at any scale. They can be simple, like a flow chart, as Colin was talking about. They just document a set of steps and show the flow. Other process maps need more framework and support and take that time. But the good thing is that the process itself, and as Colin, when he showed the process map for a process and how to develop a process map, it can be flexible. From proving basic consistency to helping solve larger problems or issues in an organization.
So where do we go next with process mapping? And this little graphic that we're showing here sort of inspired us a little bit with this, to recognize that if you have a good plan in the first place, you're likely to be more successful than if you just kind of go into it without thinking it through first. And so one of the key things I think for NRM going forward from where we completed this project, we've developed some draft system maps for document management, staff training and development. And Scott and his team are thinking about the next steps in terms of sort of making sure that those process maps are ready to go, and then taking some implementation steps. And those are really big changes in the organization, or some big things that need sort of some tuning as it goes. So I expect that those are probably, a year or two in the making, those projects. And then finally, next I should say is that, there's some other process maps that are already in use in NRM and others that have been identified sort of for development. So maybe a little bit of a wish list for some other business processes to map. And I guess another thing that I would add is that in our consulting practice, we're also using the sort of this generalized methodology for business process mapping when we talk about implementation or building organizational capacity with some other organizations that we're working with, local governments, Indigenous governments, on how to implement asset management every day. So we're already finding this useful with some other organizations as well. And with that, thank you very much for listening. And it's been a pleasure to be with you here today to make this presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much to both of, well, all three of our presenters. That was really informative. I know we already have a couple of questions in the Q&A box, but so we'll start with Anna. But if folks now want to pose their questions or raise their hands, we'll kind of go in order, because I think we have about 15 minutes here for folks to ask questions and kind of get some discussion going. So the first one is from Anna Lukianova. I'm hoping I'm saying that right. They're in the city of Powell River, BC. Have you seen asset management being linked to land use / density in your practice? For example, city of Kelowna has shown a large lot single family tax revenue is not sufficient to maintain supporting municipal infrastructure long term, and that higher density is required to sustainably maintain infrastructure. I'm curious if other municipalities have done similar work linking asset management and land use planning. Thank you.
I don't know
I'll
who,
attempt. Go, Chris. Sorry.
thanks. That's a great question. That's a really thoughtful question. And I'm curious about Scott and Colin's reflections on this, but I have two. I would take this question in two ways. I haven't seen a lot of municipalities do this, but it's a really would be very, very valuable. And the reason why is because what you're doing in asking that question or in sort of trying to find evidence for that is you're trying to just demonstrate what's the value. And so of density and of your infrastructure services. So one way of doing that is really to do scenario analyses. You could say, if you have a certain level of density within this scoped area, what it would cost on a life cycle basis to provide services for that. And if you had people sort of, if you had another scenario where it was much more spread out, and you can actually sort of cost the services that it would take to service people that are much more spread out. And that's very valuable. So that's the first first kind of consideration to that. A second quick consideration to Anna's question is when people talk about land use and density, a lot of where asset management derives value is in the services it provides. And this is probably beyond the scope of this webinar, but when people talk about land cover and the purpose of your natural assets, I think there's quite a bit of work going on in terms of how to sort of value that, and how that should be valued and how that should be recorded. So it's not always just about a density thing in terms of the cost benefit analysis. Scott, Colin?
We did a much better job than I can do on that one, Chris. I was going to add the piece around, we don't, our current system doesn't directly link the land management component of it, but one of the things that we've been focusing on a lot more through the years, especially when it comes to council and development, any development for that matter, is understanding what that life cycle cost is. Things that are, there's nothing free in life. So when an organization comes forward and wants to donate something, or if you're building a subdivision, you're developing land, whatever that might be, is understanding what the true costs are to provide those services. And I continually ask council a question: is what services are you willing to provide, or do you wish to provide, and what are you willing to pay for it? And understanding the true cost to provide a service, not just the upfront cost, if it's a low cost upfront or something's handed over, if you're developing something, or we all know how subdivisions typically are land development occurs. It's also understanding what that full cycle cost is, analysis to understand what the cost is to provide that service.
The only quick thing I'll add, and it's quick, is that at least in BC, we tend to talk about official community plans as being sort of the founding document that just defines how you intend to use land in your municipality or your community. And First Nations use comprehensive community plan to mean the same thing. That document is an opportunity to connect asset management and asset management principles and practices to your land use planning. And so when you're talking about, Chris, I couldn't agree more with what you said. It's Scott as well, life cycle costing. Build those things into your next OCP update and think about them as you're engaging with your community on your OCP. And I think that helps to make that real, that connection.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a question from one of our team members is, could Northern Rockies Regional Municipality elaborate on what they're doing around community awareness as part of this process?
Well, that's a step that we're kind of into now, to be honest with you. We've always preached and communicated the asset management component and our process. And what we've started to focus on, and actually this afternoon, we're going into a strategic planning session with council, and one of the larger discussion is around service levels to the community, and what does that look like, and how do we communicate that? And so, when we talk about it's not necessarily shifting focus, but that evolution of what we're doing is, at first it was getting that culture understood and the processes understood internally, and now we're focusing. Not that we haven't done anything externally, but there's a larger focus that we've shifted course a little bit. There's a larger focus when it comes to that communication externally, and it's sending a message to the community or the region around what we're responsible for, like what's truly what do we have control over. We use a sphere of influence is what we use internally now. We've started in terms so council understand is what you actually have control over. Because sometimes people think local government have control over everything. So we have limitations, and then things that we do have control over in the service we do provide. What's the cost to provide those services, and what's the community willing to bear? that's the focus that we really start working on. And we just recently had a trade show in the community where we had a booth in it, and our council members actually wore a T-shirt that said, what does my taxes pay for? And on the back it listed all the various services that the organization provides the community. And the key piece is getting people to understand that there's a significant amount of services that are provided, but there's a cost of those, and a cost of those to maintain them and to provide the sustainable service. So that's our focus now through our various platforms. And the key piece too is educating council. Chris showed that slide where council have changing priorities, new councils come in, and it's also educating, re-educating, educating the new council with what that looks like, so they understand. Because of course, sometimes you have elected officials roll in that think that they can change the world overnight. So it's a bit of a journey, but like I said, for us, we're working on it. We've changed our focus has shifted a little bit more now to educating the community.
I think we have time for one more question, and I see some people are starting to drop off, but I'm going to ask everyone to please, if you can, stay to the very end, because we have some feedback questions that we would like answered. But we do have one more question for the group, and then we'll go to some resources and some links for folks. This one is from Ingrid. I'm building a climate adaptation workshop for youth capacity building. Could you scale this asset management process down to a school property as a means of introducing local nature-based solutions and green building management? Does this exist, and can you point me towards it?
That's a great question. And it's awesome that you're kind of working with youth on this, Ingrid. I think absolutely. The answer is absolutely. And there are resources and we can definitely share those. But basically what you could do is you get kids and maybe they're thinking about their own school. You ask them in a discussion format, like what some of the potential climate impacts are that could impact their school property. And that could, for example, could be flooding. It could be extreme heat. And then you can ask them, so what are some ways of if we know that there's going to be more flooding at your school, what are some ways to adapt to that? And that might be things like, well, you could dig up bigger pipes or you can sort of plant, think about green infrastructure types of solutions. So there's different ways of facilitating that. And I'm happy to follow up with you about that.
Okay, so there's we're going to just sort of go forward here in wrapping up, and I just wanted to sort of thank you folks for your answering the questions. There is a another question in the question and answer box if the speakers want to go in and read it or maybe type their answers to it. I'm just going to go forward here with our presentation and wrap up for today. So speaking back on this thematic package that Chris mentioned in his presentation, and I believe Sarah has already shared the links to, this is on our content that we discussed here today and includes things like the checklist and the video that Chris was mentioning, and it's available in both French and English. We do also for MAMP have a key resource library. So this is where a lot of our online resources live, everything from guidebooks to checklists to videos to toolkits. And Sarah will be putting the links, all of those links in the chat. Briefly, sorry, I just want to pause here and let people know. Links to this recorded video will be available to people afterwards. And we do have a list of the attendees that we will be sending around links. We do have permission from Chris, but I'll check in with Colin and Scott afterwards for their presentation as well. And we'll be sharing all the links that are available in this presentation for people to go through. We also have available training opportunities both online and through partners like AM Ontario, a nice little plug for Chris there, to do asset management training. So there's a few different sub-sites under this one. So if folks want to learn more about the training, they can go to this website here. And I'm going to quickly launch a poll for people, and I would really appreciate anyone that's still on the call to fill this out. Obviously, if you're FCM staff, please do not participate. There's just a few questions for folks, and if we could just get folks to answer to the best of their abilities. While I kind of go through a little bit of what's next, that would be great for us. So the next webinar is actually this Thursday. Our partner program, GMF, is having another webinar for net zero. And the links will also be in the chat, but if you go to GMF's website, there will be links there for folks. Okay, I'm just giving everybody a minute. Looks like we've had about half of everybody answering the questions, so I'll just give everybody a second. Lastly, we mentioned sort of the next national adaptation strategy planning that we're doing. If you want sort of more from our program, you can sign up for asset management training. Again, there's that link. There's also our FCM Connect, which is news about municipal funding and training, or the resource library. So all of these are scannable. And yeah, we'll make sure that these are available for people in the email that we send around. I see people are making a few connections in the chat. Chris mentioned a little bit about collaboration. We did just have a collaboration insight sort of launched today on the FCM website. So we do encourage people to collaborate here as much as possible in sharing, because I think, you know, Chris, Scott, and Colin all showed today sort of different levels and variations of different types of collaboration that's possible between consultants, between municipalities, between regions, and across disciplines. And I think that that's really important. We're hoping to have a future webinar from MAMP on this topic, so stay tuned. Hey, I see we've got about 92 people have participated, so thank you very much. I'm going to end the poll. Okay. And I'm just doing the Zoom thing here. Okay. Yes, thank you so much to everybody for attending. We really appreciate everyone on the call, and thank you to our guest speakers, for Chris, Colin, and Scott for joining us today and doing their presentations. I certainly learned a few things, which is always great, but I see that there was quite a bit of participation in the questions. So I want to thank everybody for joining us, and hopefully we will see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.